Welcome back to the SSPX Podcast. Today, in the second part of our ongoing series, Digital Dangers, we'll examine the effects of modern technology on our mental fitness, spiritual well-being, and even on our physical health. While technologies such as smartphones, state-of-the-art search engines, and artificial intelligence give us access to vast reservoirs of information, are we harming ourselves intellectually through the superficial acquisition of knowledge? What adverse effects does this technology have on brain development? And can it even lead to addiction? Moreover, is technology damaging our capacity to have interpersonal relationships? And most importantly, our relationship with God? These and other concerns will be addressed by Father Jonathan Kopek on this second episode of Digital Dangers.
Father, welcome back.
Thanks, Jim.
Thank you for joining us again. Do you want to recap what we talked about last time to set the stage for today?
Sure. So we basically introduced this idea that even just the simple use of the machine is having an effect on us. And we kind of made the bold statement that in some way or another, it's weakening us, at least just kind of on the mental neurological level. And that's really just on a physical level. So just the use of the screen and the way it's forming my brain to be wired to want to use it more. It's already kind of causing this overstimulation, this mental fatigue, and we can already start seeing, let's say the beginnings of what we can call an actual addiction, because that's when our habits are basically hijacked, our neurological, pathways are basically hijacked in order to kind of need to keep using this thing. So that we just kind of started on just the basic idea of, okay, well, there's a danger here, and the danger is that it's weakening us mentally, and we're going to have to deal with that prudently. And then we opened the door to, but there's more. And the more is we're walking into a world that poses a lot of moral issues. And we haven't quite finished, talking about just the effects of just using the thing as well, the machine.
Sure. So it seems like we have a lot of things to discuss, doing the deep dive into how it affects us. Mm-hmm. So let's start there.
Okay.
Because there are a number of places one could start, let's take the low-hanging fruit, not in the level of importance, but in the most universal way,
sure,
maybe that it affects us to you.
Okay. Alrighty. Well, I think if you were to picture yourself in, a factory, and you're on a line, an assembly line, and your job is to, whatever it is, do 3/4 of a crank in this direction and add that piece, and then it goes on. Well, if you do that year after year after year after year, in a sense, that starts to become your life. And the more we repeat actions, and the more we work towards a certain goal, and the more we perform, sort of like a conglomeration of acts and intentions, well, that starts to form how we think. So you could picture yourself after so many years of this, just really starting to think of yourself as a cog in a machine, and really starting to value efficiency more than anything else, and productivity and things like that, because, well, the factory in a sense starts to become your life, especially if that's all you have. I think if we were to take sort of that image and apply it to ever since we started using machines, which kind of in and of themselves are more capable than we are, all of a sudden we've hit this new pace of life, this new spirit of life that's been pushing us on and kind of speeding everything up. And so, again, this is going to apply to just our use of our smart devices and things like that, in the sense that these are really kind of like the conglomeration, the prism of that kind of way of life. But my point, just to start off with, is that, what we're all kind of used to calling life, it shouldn't be normal, in the sense of we shouldn't always feel like we're having to rush towards a deadline. We shouldn't always feel like we're behind and exhausted and underpaid and underappreciated. We shouldn't always feel like factory workers, in a sense. We should, best case scenario, have a true appreciation for our day to day, because this is where we find the will of God. And this is where we can find, beauty and peace of soul and happiness. But the kind of the impetus of the machine that we started has created a new normal for us, and it's created this new set of normal circumstances which aren't in fact normal. And so I bring that up as sort of like our opening image because I think it's important to realize that, we have to find a way back. That I don't think it's not an accident that so many people in the world today, even far outside Catholic circles, are starting to realize there's something wrong. We've lost something and we need to find our way back to kind of just like a natural way of living. Well, we need to find our way back to a natural way of living. And like we're going to say later on, I think today, especially in the sense of our spiritual life. So let's say this, you have this impetus of this kind of like fast moving productivity, efficiency based world. And then it gets distilled into your smart device. And that's going to take, this new set of normal, which isn't really normal at all, and becomes very, very superficial, and just feed it right into us and right into our families, right into our daily lives. And all of a sudden, even people that are very far from factories or factory life or the business world are feeling like they're, on this new train of life. And well, then it has deeper effects. So the first effect that I kind of wanted to just draw attention to is sort of a conclusion to last time is just this harriedness, this unnatural kind of rush and superficiality of our lives that we need to find a way back from. And well, it's going to come down to how we use our technology, because it's our decisions there that are really going to kind of point us in one direction or another.
So you're situating then, again, this is part recap from the first talk, but the smartphone is both an outgrowth of a pre-existing sort of movement, right? Out of nowhere, a difference of degree and of kind. But maybe a further distinction would be helpful if you can distinguish between machines and tools.
Okay.
Is that something that
that's a fair distinction? Yeah, because it's one of those things where a tool is something that is kind of morally indifferent. It's however you want to use it. I can use my hammer to build your house, or I can hit you in the head, or whatever it is. The difference is that, you nailed it, because we do call, or at least I call, the smartphone and smart technology a machine versus a tool. So the difference there is a tool has a proportionate effect to how much I'm putting into it.
Okay.
And I can do some extra damage with a hammer, but it's still only to the degree that I can swing that hammer. It's going to be proportionate to the strength that I'm putting into it.
So an extension of you.
It's an extension of me, right? It's more or less a natural extension. A machine is when the effect is disproportionate to when you're putting in. So it's got a much bigger effect to what I'm putting into. Okay. So, an example of a machine in this kind of context, what we're talking about would be like a car or a gun. Okay. So I push my foot down a little bit, and all of a sudden I'm traveling 60 miles an hour. Or I squeeze my finger, and all of a sudden I've blown something up. Like that's a disproportionate effect. And so even though we can still say using a machine in some way is morally indifferent, you can't quite say that, because it just in the sense of, yes, whatever goal you pick, that's going to determine the morality. Where you're driving or what you're shooting, that's going to determine the morality of you using that machine. And yet, again, kind of one of our conclusions last time was using a machine, especially something that is dangerous like a gun, is going to require a higher degree of prudence, a higher degree of education, and all that sort of thing, because I could really harm something. I could harm someone else, that I can harm myself. And so that we would say that definitely applies to the smartphone, because now with just, very little input, I can access any information in the world. I can access any, culture or lie or truth, whatever it is. It's extremely powerful what I can do. But again, more to the point, there's something about the use of a machine that has an effect on the user, perhaps more than the use of a tool does on the user. So the builder using the hammer, you can kind of say he starts to think like a builder based off of his tools. But the more we have kind of entered into this machine world with this disproportion and with this advancement, this constant increase, well, the more that's affected us. So what we do in some way determines how we are and who we are and how we think. And the use of machines, especially extremely powerful ones, and especially ones that have some sort of intellectual capacity, broadly speaking, is going to affect how we think, how we are, and who we are as a person. And so that's kind of where we're getting at as far as, these things are shaping us. And I don't mean that in like a weird kind of conspiratorial way. It's we're being shaped by our use of things.
No, is it too bold to say then that, let's say with a tool, you could have, for instance, the habit of carpentry, but it's something that you're still the agent. Moreover, you have a control over that, and you're arguing with some of these machines, particularly modern machines like smartphones, that it's more controlling you than you controlling it. So there's a disproportionate influence and impact
on who I am. Yeah.
Okay.
And that's not only, we haven't really talked too much about this, but that's for two reasons. The first is just the nature of this advanced technology itself is already going to be kind of controlling me because it's more powerful than I am in a lot of these, on what it can do, how fast it can access information and things like that. But another reason that we can say that is that, these are being controlled. Smartphones just don't come out of nowhere. It's not, you order a hammer and someone makes it, and then you get it, and then, okay, well, that's it. Yeah. That's as far as it goes. No, these things are constantly connected to thousands of people with all of their own ends and all of their own purposes in designing the applications and the interface and everything about the smartphone and what it can do. And that's certainly what we're saying is that it's not passive. The phone is not passive. It is acting on us for sure. Yeah.
Okay. So with all of that in mind, can you talk a little bit about how this affects habitual dispositions then?
Sure.
You've hinted at this, and now the question is really, okay, if we've established that is the case, that it has that kind of, even to the point where we can say it controls us, so what are the downstream effects of that? Okay.
So one of the big things that we like about our technology is that it makes things easy.
Sure.
And that makes sense.
Yeah.
No one wants to work harder than they have to.
Right. This is the great promise of technology. This is how everyone got sucked in.
Yeah.
Right.
And why we continue to stay so. Because, especially once something becomes easy, who's going to go back and find a harder way to do it without a really good reason to do so? Well, okay, that's something we need to talk about, actually. Okay. So here's a different image for you. Picture yourself now, sitting on a beanbag in a nice, comfortable room, and you're more or less the emperor of the country, and sitting there on your beanbag, everything that you could possibly need is brought to you. Your food is brought to you, your drinks are brought to you. You don't have to get up and do anything because you're the ruler of the world. Well, what's going to happen is certain aspects about you are definitely going to start to become unused. So you're gonna quickly get out of shape because you're not gonna be eating or exercising or anything like that. But anything about our nature that we don't exercise also gets out of shape. So it's not just a question of we gain weight and I can't run anymore. How we're designed, it's in just the whole order of God in creating us, is that the more we work something out, the more we have to kind of come across friction, the stronger we become, and vice versa. And so the easier my life is, the less strong I need to be in order to overcome it. Okay, this is sort of a broad topic, but the idea is that the less we work something, the less it strengthens. And resilience, on the other hand, is built up by resistance, friction.
Sure.
And vice versa. So the technology world, especially the smartphone, seeks to eliminate resistance. They want to make life, we want to make life with it as easy as possible. But in the process of that eliminates, us being able to strengthen ourselves. And I mean something so much more than strength. Really what we're going to come down to is virtue.
Okay.
So think of it this way, again, on the physical level, if you never run, if you never work out, if you never exercise, your muscles start to atrophy. They shrink. The less we use something, naturally speaking, the less it shrinks. Well, it turns out that even still physically speaking, the same thing happens with our brains, believe it or not. So, and this is recent discoveries. I was reading a book just a couple months ago about kind of the influence of screens in the school system. So the public school system has really been trying to integrate technology and screens because that's what the kids want. And they've been doing all these studies, and it turns out, there's aspects of children's brains that are shrinking because in their lower years, when they're supposed to be working out these quote unquote like mental muscles, we can call them, which is areas of our brain, they don't have to, because the computer, whatever it is doing that work for them. So, we all kind of, I think, are familiar with sort of like the TV, all that's kind of killing the kid's imagination.
Yeah.
In fact, there's something very measurable about that they're only recently kind of, discovering and documenting. And it is that the parts of our brain, physically speaking, that we activate in order to do things like problem solving and basically using our imagination to come up with something, those literally are working less the more we have some sort of screen interface to do imaginative work for us. Well, the problem is that as we grow up with that lack of having to work out, those parts of our brain atrophy and they become smaller. And now we end up with an adult who has very little capability of problem solving, of having to come up with solution. And that might explain, I think, in some ways, and we kind of come across these mind-blowing scenarios, like how could you not think of that when you're talking?
Sure.
But so again, that's kind of on the physical level, but we can keep this idea going of the less friction we come across, the easier our life becomes, the weaker we end up being on the other side, and vice versa. And I'm not saying we all have to become, crazy penitents and make our life as miserable as possible. Obviously, there's going to be a balance and all of that. But the problem is that, well, the machines and the technology world, the digital world, is not seeking a balance. It's seeking, as much as possible, the elimination of resistance. Resistance to accessing knowledge, entertainment, pleasure, social status, everything. So, why learn how to cook a dinner, for example, when you can app a food delivery? Why study when you can Google any answer you can possibly think of? Why learn how to write or present an answer when you can have an AI do it for you? Why socialize when you can get on a meta world and have the semblance of a social life? Why marry when you can have at least the physical aspects of marriage presented all over a screen? To just go very bluntly to some of the worst points. But especially I kind of want to draw attention to that when I say why study when you can Google anything. That especially is one of the huge points that got us kind of on this topic is that more and more in our students, we're running across this lack of motivation to know, to learn, to study. And it's because you can say, whatever you want from the podium, but in their desks, many of them, especially if they grow up in sort of a more tech savvy digital environment, they're saying in their mind, I don't need this. I really what's the point of me having to study? The child isn't going to make the necessary conclusions that, well, if I don't study, my brain's going to be pretty worthless by the time I'm 25.
Right.
Or, if for some reason I can't Google something, then I'm not going to be able to figure it out. And they're not going to know that. They see that, oh, well, I have Google, I got YouTube, I got Wikipedia, I got ChatGPT, and what else do I need? This is pointless. And it's really weakening us. So kind of the term to sum up this idea is that the more we use technology, the more shallow we are becoming. And shallow in the sense of just, a lack of intellectual depth, of moral depth, of mental depth.
Yeah.
We're kind of coming to this conclusion of we're becoming more shallow in our thinking, more shallow in our work, more shallow in, even just the goals that we're working towards. And we're just it's kind of the antithesis of craftsmanship. Why work and make a beautiful product when you can, order something online that does the same thing, but way cheaper, et cetera. Well, all of that sort of shallow use and shallow result is creating shallow people. It's creating a shallowness of character. And any parent, I hope that thinks about this would say, well, I wouldn't want for my child to grow up to be a shallow person that's not capable of making their own decisions. Well, we have to connect the cause and effect. We're seeing a lot of, universally, I think we're seeing a lot of, shallow characters growing up. And I think too often we might be naive in drawing that to the cause. Are we making life for our children too easy? Yes, we are. and not just in the sense of the technological term. I mean, obviously this is going to be kind of, broadening out as far as, kind of just the whole spirit of the world, and, whether or not we're demanding, a certain degree of discipline from our children and responsibility and things like that. But the more we take all that away, well, we're kind of taking away their ability to strengthen themselves, to grow in this sort of thing.
No, it's an interesting question. And so you're positing a causal link between the technology itself and ultimately the shallowness. And then you're throwing out there that probably anyone listening is going to say, I obviously don't want that conclusion. I don't want shallow children. I myself don't want to be shallow, but either don't see that it's a causal link or don't see the extent to which it's a causal link.
Right.
But
I think, kind of like I mentioned before, it's something that we can at least try and examine ourselves on honestly. Sure. Am I trying to make life too easy for myself, and is it actually? Or am I finding that the more I kind of try and go into this ease of life, the more kind of stressed I become, and the more kind of sucked into the machine I become, or just the more incapable I am of running my life, of living up to a schedule, of getting tasks done, especially tasks that need to be done. I mean, I think if every parent really seriously asks themselves the question, am I wasting time on my devices that I otherwise could be spending necessarily on my family? Well, a lot of times it's going to be yes, but I mean, we can all ask ourselves that question. Am I giving time to this thing just because it's easier? And that indicates in us, maybe not some sort of grave evil. I'm not saying that, but it's indicating in us, well, a certain weakness. We've become weaker because we've kind of let this whole machine world start to do the work for us.
Right. So it's not about making things harder as such. This ties into something much deeper. And this is where you were speaking about character, and then ultimately the question of virtue.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. And obviously that's the end goal. So there's two things that I kind of want to say about virtue. And the first is that, we know the spiritual axiom, grace builds on nature, right? Well, what that really means is that as far as our spiritual life goes, our salvation, our closeness to our Lord goes, all of that grace is a gift from God, period. It's something that he grants by his own mercy and love. But when we say grace builds on nature, okay, the nature part, that part's up to us. If the wind's blowing, am I going to open the sail? If the water's flowing, am I going to collect it so that, when the time of drought, I have something to drink? The natural part is, everything from just my ability to pay attention, to my ability to stick to a task or to overcome difficulties, to see difficulties as something to overcome and not just obstacles and, I just can't do it. That sort of frame of mind, that character, if it is too shallow, then we're not going to be disposing ourselves to a deep and rich spiritual life. Because, if for example, I get too used to just this lack of friction, well, why would I push myself to be virtuous in areas that it's difficult to be virtuous? If I'm already just on the basic level of like never, making myself clean my room or cook a meal or do a hard day's work or just, challenge myself. But again, that's even more still on a superficial level. If we go a little bit deeper, if we don't challenge ourselves intellectually, well, what that means is that we're not disposing ourselves for the virtue of faith even. So now this is becoming a lot more fundamental, and a lot more of a problem. If, for example, I don't ever come across an intellectual challenge where I need to understand something that's difficult and figure out cause to effect or a deeper principle or something like that, and really make my intellect grow by my own natural efforts, then when our Lord offers me the grace of an increase of faith, it's not going to have that natural disposition necessarily to work with. And that's on me. That's on me. So I'm not saying that God isn't capable of, making whatever transformation in us that he wants. But the normal way that things work is that my own efforts are sort of the proportional disposition of how I'm going to grow in virtue. Even though it's not due to my own efforts that I receive the grace, that's still a gift of God. Okay. But that habitual disposition that I'm making by my own efforts is what's opening that up. Okay, well that's that's a problem now. Now this is a bigger problem, because if we want our children to be virtuous, to be, growing in the state of sanctifying grace, which is the whole point, which is, the beginning of heaven and the most necessary thing. Okay, well then I need to give them the dispositions to be virtuous, and that's not ease of life. That's not the machine world of efficiency and productivity. It's the life of me learning to have to grapple first with nature and then myself, and to really have to overcome those things. So that's kind of the first thing as far as how this affects our spiritual life. Another one, and this is going to it's going to dovetail a little bit, but branch off a little bit from the shallow idea to more just a kind of a different way that this is affecting us, but it's going to be connected. So when I say shallow thinking, and how that can create not such a good disposition for the grace of faith, for example. Well, okay, I'm going to be a little bit more precise there. Shallow thinking. In fact, this is something that is also in the last decade has been the topic of a lot of study. And there are neuroscientists in the world today that are excited because it seems to them that we are going through another stage of evolution in their terms, right? And what I mean by that is that, okay, with big advancements in technology and how that interplays with our nature, we end up thinking differently in some way or another. So just an example from history is before the written word and after the written word. If you're reading the Greek philosophers fighting against the idea of writing things down because that's going to wreck things, and in a sense it did.
Yes.
In a sense it brought a lot of good to us, and in another sense, okay, well we lost something there, right? Okay, well the study now is that our habitual use of technology is once again changing how we think. And here's what I mean by that. So there's two ways you can do this. One we'll call kind of linear. I'm making that term up. I don't know if that's I
don't think it's a made up term.
Okay. Maybe I'm using it accurately. I just can't remember. But just in case. Okay. We'll say I'll take credit for that term or the other way if I'm using it incorrectly. But by linear thought, I mean this. I go from one, starting topic to another related point and so on. And I go from point to point to point, and it's going more or less in a line. Sure. Are we okay with calling that linear? Okay. Yeah. And that's normally how we think. Not only normally how we think, but that's how we give information to each other. That's how a book progresses. Yeah. That's how we're used to thinking.
That's how salvation history proceeds.
All that good thing. So, linear thought is, I guess you could say has been the status quo. Okay. And we can make the argument based off of the great philosophers, and especially St. Thomas Aquinas, that this is the natural way of thinking. This is how we think. This is how the faculties of our soul work. We receive information through the senses, our intellect processes it, we come up with the term, and we connect things together, and we reason. And all of that's connected and flows in a line. Sure. And how we act, again, is based off of how we think. And especially when I say act, we can already draw the conclusion, this is how we pray. We start with an initial thought. For example, have you ever done the Ignatian exercises? It's, here's your disposition of place, here's the grace you're asking for, and now go into it. And it's connected. And all of that connection leads to this final soliloquy where you're speaking to God based off of this kind of formation that you made. That's all interconnected. Okay, well, that's the status quo. The thinking that technology is bringing us to, and that the neuroscientists are applauding as this new great thing is what we can call fragmented thinking. So the difference is, instead of going from point A to B to C in a linear motion, I can go from A to X squared up here in an instant. It really just, it looks a lot like how most of us navigate getting online. So I want to, Google search, I want to raise chickens. And so I type in raising chickens. And what that can quickly bring me to is, I have 80,000 results. Yeah. And clicking on this one can bring me to someone's blog with a whole bunch of hyperlinks. And from there, I can go to an Amazon page and decide I can already start buying chicken wire, or I can start watching videos and a review. But then those videos on the side can instantly link me to something completely unrelated, like cute videos of puppies or something like that. Sure. And then I can go back, I can respond to a couple texts on the side. I can all of a sudden, take a quick dive and scan a couple pages on different breeds of chicken. And in 20 minutes work, I can kind of come to the conclusion, I know quite a bit about raising chickens.
Yeah.
And I've already even purchased a few things. And that was amazingly fast, like that. I did that way better than sitting down, or faster, let's say, much more quickly than sitting down with a farmer.
And it is something that no one in human history could do until the last.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
It's amazing that we can gain that sort of knowledge. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, the difference is, there's a couple differences. One is that we're not dealing with deep knowledge, right? This is a shallow knowledge. I've scratched the surface, literally. Chicken scratched the surface on this kind of art, let's say. And if I ever actually get chickens, I'm gonna have a whole lot more to learn on the experiential level. And if I were to actually just sit down with a chicken farmer who has years and years of a deep knowledge of this particular craft or trade, okay, I would have concluded with a much deeper knowledge on it. So that's one thing, is that we're dealing with a shallow knowledge, which is incomplete and imperfect, if we're being honest with ourselves. But another thing is that, and this is kind of more to the point, the more we go into that way of thinking and accessing knowledge in that fragmented manner, once again, we're training our brain, like that whole, network of interconnected pathways and centers in our brain, we're training it to think in that fragmented manner. So instead of going from A to B to C, I go from this point to a completely more or less related, not necessarily related, to a completely unrelated point, and just jumping from thing to thing, scratching the surface, getting what I need, and then moving on. And the problem with that is that the more we get into that habit of thinking, the more just universally shallow our knowledge is going to become. Already we could say, okay, goodbye to art. Because that requires not only deep knowledge of a topic, but it requires deep work in order to to produce it. But goodbye to philosophy, because there's no longer the need or the desire to dwell deeply on a topic and find its most deepest causes and principles. And then, well, goodbye to prayer. And that's the biggest problem, is because if prayer is meant to go from this point A, this presence of God or whatever it is, to a deeper and deeper access to the nature of God, which we can call contemplation, contemplative prayer. And our prayer is only essentially going to be good as our natural disposition to be able to pay attention to it, and to really focus deeper into something, so that we can dispose ourselves to become more passive to God's work in our soul, which is kind of the basis of contemplation. Okay, the more I'm losing those abilities, the more I'm really losing my ability to pray. And if I can't pray, what happens to my spiritual life? Like prayer is the only thing that we intellectual beings can do as far as actually connecting to God our Father. And that's something that we have to do. And so again, if we were to just stop right here and take a step back and just say, okay, if we were to diagnose our prayers, who can, hopefully someone can out there, but I would be surprised if many people can say confidently that it's been, in the last couple of years, that they've been able to offer one decade of the rosary without some legitimate distraction getting in the way, much less a couple Hail Marys. On the one hand, okay, we're human beings. We have to, it's difficult, and distraction is in some way always going to be part of our, circumstances. And yet, if, all the great spiritual writers, really all of the greats that have been held up by the church as, this is a master of the spiritual life, will say that we are all called to some degree of contemplation, to some deeper degree of prayer. And we're having, the time of our lives being able to make it through a rosary, much less a decade, much less a Hail Mary sometimes. Something's wrong with that. This is a problem.
Yeah.
And not only that, but, if we're not making a concerted and continuous effort in our prayer life, meaning trying to pray better, trying to focus more, trying to really become that much more intimate with our Lord on a spiritual level, well, then what are we doing as far as our Catholic life is concerned? We're living on the surface. It's a shallow spirituality. It's a shallow Catholicism. And I'm not saying that we're basing everything on, a shallow spiritual life on the fact that we have a smartphone in our pocket.
Sure.
I'm not saying that. Again, this goes back to the whole world we're living in. This is the result of a continuous movement and impetus away from nature and intellectuality and the good sense and, and prayer and silence and contemplation. Well, if we take this device that is the result of that movement and it starts to control our life, is it any wonder that many of us say to ourselves, wow, I just have such a hard time praying. I just have such a hard time.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the stakes can't be higher.
Right.
When you put it like that. Let me play devil's advocate, though, on one point.
Hit me.
Well, it's several points, but connected to what you said, you gave the example of looking for, chickens and things like that. And you're right that, the knowledge you would get in actually, let's say, raising chickens for a year would not just quantitatively increase your knowledge, but qualitatively affect it as well.
Right.
But I think someone could argue, okay, but not everyone's actually going to be a chicken farmer. This is, as far as shallow learning goes, not everyone is going to be a contemplative cloistered monk. Not everyone is going to really study history in their lives. So isn't it better than nothing, right? Isn't it better than nothing to do a little bit of chicken, searching on Google? Isn't it better than nothing to get on a Zoom rosary, with people all over the world? Because that's all these technological devices have allowed me to do something. So isn't that better than nothing? That's the devil's advocate.
Okay. It's a good question. The problem is that depending on where we branch off of the question, the answer is going to vary a little bit. Sure. So if we were to say, on the intellectual knowledge level or the skill level, is it better than nothing? I think in some ways we can say yes. I mean, as far as being able to access some knowledge of an art or to find an answer quickly, whereas it would have otherwise been, there's not something intrinsically wrong with that. However, there are two caveats that go along with that. The first is that, again, we're dealing with something that the more we use that sort of ability, the more we're disposing ourselves to have to use that sort of ability. So there's a big difference between, well, isn't it better that I can just quickly learn about something and move on with my life? It's like, well, yes, but where does the line get drawn as far as that's what I always do? And all of a sudden I find myself, I'm not going deeply into anything. And then we open the door to a possibility of, okay, well, is it even always better? Because if our life is really meant to be, and it really is meant to be, the consecration of the current moment, well, maybe it isn't even necessarily better for us to gain shallow knowledge and little things if it's pulling me away from just being able to do what I'm doing now well, mindfully and consecrated. So, I mean, I think it's too much for me to come down, or for anyone to come down with a hammer and just say, thou shalt never Google, and well, that just wouldn't work. I mean, in some ways it's too much, I think, at least in this, to just say it's a moral possibility. However, I think that the conclusion, personal opinion time. My personal conclusion on this would be, I think that if we had it in mind to do it as little as possible, and especially in proportion to how important the thing is that we're dealing with. So if it is actually just learning something about chickens, okay, fine, Google it, find your answer. If it's, but what are the main facets of the spiritual life? What's the deal behind the crisis in the church? What should I think about this, this moment in history, or this aspect of Catholicism or philosophy or whatever is okay. Now we have to be honest with ourselves. I'm not just dealing with the chicken coop here. I'm dealing with something very important. If I'm going to try and understand something deeply, that's when, because now the proportion's bigger, or the value of the thing is bigger in proportion to that value, that's when it isn't better, in my opinion. It's not better to Google search, what should I think about this person, or what's the crisis in the church, except insofar as that can lead me to a deeper source of knowledge. I personally would be willing to go down on that. Then if we follow that kind of train of thought, okay, if our intention is to use it just kind of have like this intent of using it as little as possible, because I don't want to let myself get sucked into this habitually becoming easy and shallow. And then one step up from that is I positively don't want to use it for sources of deeper knowledge. For that, I want, a deeper source of knowledge, like a trustworthy book or a person or something like that. Okay, well then I think the big conclusion when it comes to our spiritual life, no, if we're using some sort of technological means as an aspect of our spiritual life, what we're saying is we're using something artificial. And I think that I'm not going to put my opinion as absolutely not, because for example, if I were locked up, in prison, or I was in a place where I could never access the sacraments or something like that, then I could see that it probably would be worth my time to watch a live stream of a traditional mass somewhere, listen to a sermon, all those good things, obviously. But I would say that there needs to be a much more serious kind of set of circumstances instead of, every morning, for my morning prayers, I watch a mass, and then, I say a decade of the rosary and then move on with my day. That can't replace mental prayer, period. So in that sense, no, it's not better. And I don't think I have to say that one's my opinion. We cannot replace our spiritual life with some sort of digital semblance to it. Because then it stops becoming us. And if it's not us, well, then it's not contact of my soul with Christ. Of course not. It doesn't matter what people are saying or what we're hearing, or maybe, how nice I feel because of how beautiful this sounds or something like that. If I'm not accessing the divinity with my intellect and will, then it's not prayer. And so in that sense, I would stand with a little bit is not better there.
Okay. So you've worked us step by step all the way up to contemplation really being what is at stake here.
Mm-hmm. I guess I didn't quite answer all of your question, because you said, so contemplation. You said, someone might say, I'm not going to be a monk anytime soon. I have 12 kids or whatever it is. I'm not this whole contemplative life thing. Well, in a sense, that's something that we do need to understand more about our universal vocation. We are, even if you're not called to be a monk or a priest or a brother or a sister, whatever it is, religious sister, we are all called by God to an intimate life with him in our soul. And that life is, again, another word for that is a contemplative life. And so this is something that, the Archbishop really instilled in us, as far as how he wanted priests to be formed in the seminary. This is what we call the soul of the apostolate. It's, our actual effectiveness in our life, our living our vocation, whether we're a layman, a priest, or a monk in a monastery somewhere. It all comes down to how rich is my spiritual life? How close am I to Christ? How faithful am I to my mental prayer, which is, kind of our first main disposition to contemplation. That is for all of us. And that is a thought, an idea, an ideal, I think, that's very often lost, even in Catholic circles today, just because of how secular the world has become and how secular our lives need to be. We kind of just think, either, well, I couldn't be a religious, and so there goes, this deeper sense of prayer life. No, that's just not it. That's letting the secular world become too much of our life. That's simply not what we're called to. What we are called to is, in some degree, according to our state in life, some degree of contemplation, and that's a universal call. And so again, now it's back on us. Okay, if we can identify something, and even kind of scientifically, we're identifying something that is affecting our ability to pray, we have to do something about this again.
Okay.
It comes down to, some sort of very conscious effort on not letting this active machine ruin my ability to get closer to God. That's what it's going to come down to. Some positive effort on our part. Again, we're not just saying, go live under a hill somewhere, but we are saying we have to act on a higher level of prudence and education to make sure that we're controlling not only our character, our virtue, our habits, but our prayer life, and not just letting it being swept away.
Okay. Well, that's sobering, Father. And maybe this by way of conclusion. So you've walked us sort of up this mountain, starting with how smartphones and things affect us and little daily steps, all the way up to how it affects our spiritual life and our union with God. So if you can walk us back down now on a practical level, would you say? I think you are saying, steps that would help lead to contemplation include. Mm-hmm. Getting rid of, to the extent you can, your smartphone. Doesn't include then also, cooking with your family instead of ordering out, or hanging out with your friends and talking to real people. Mm-hmm. I mean, is that all? It's part of the big picture.
Those are all part of the big picture.
Okay.
And I hope that, in our ongoing conversation, we will kind of nail those points more individually as we get along. But yeah, I mean, I think the general conclusion, at least from this idea, is that, while not intentionally making life as hard as possible, because that's not the point at all. That's not Catholicism. Yeah. We do, if we can identify a problem, and this problem is this shallow-inducing thing, to walk back down means to have it as sort of a principle in our life, both to give a priority of importance to the more important things, which is, first of all, our spiritual life, and then to have an intention to try and find ways to act against this negative influence, this shallow influence. So yeah, if I realize, wow, I do just waste time, okay, one of the ways I'm going to act against that is I'm going to, really push myself to try and, not just, run a tighter schedule, but to use my time more meaningfully, more mm-hmm. worthily in a sense. Mm-hmm. If I realize, my social life is fake and I'm living a false persona all the time and pretending it's making me feel more worthwhile, well, then I'm going to act against that by trying to spend time, like worthwhile time with my friends and family, especially if I have a family, et cetera. If I just can't concentrate for a moment when I try and say my prayers, I have to take, steps to start turning my screens off. And then I need to start disposing myself to be able to pray. It's not going to be as easy as just, I don't use my smartphone anymore, or I don't use it 80% as much as I used to. It's going to be a process of getting back into shape, into mental shape, to learning how to concentrate again. So to start with reading a book, for example, and being able to read a chapter at a time, and then to study and to study our faith. Yeah. Which seems like it would be very helpful to read scripture, and then mm-hmm. all that kind of like more, I guess we'd call that like a naturalizing reprocessing. Yes. All of that's what's going to start bringing us back to, where we need to be. I'm not gonna lay down, again, I'm not gonna lay down any sort of, this absolutely means everyone needs to chuck their smartphone over a bridge. But we all really do have to ask ourselves again, okay, if there are at least some aspects of it that can go, what can go? Start with that. Because as long as it's a continual feed into our life, we can want to be better or deeper all we want, but it's not going to matter. And then try and keep asking yourself that question: what can go? What can I do better? Again, not to start the fight, but to just say, what can I take from this to do better?
All right. Thank you, Father.
Sure.
We'll jump into the other issues in the next few episodes.
Looking forward to it.
Thanks, Father.